In this video, we're going to look at shared preferences. Now, there'll be times when you're developing that you want to save certain information in between launches of your application. These could be things like the user's name, maybe a game score, login information, really any kind of information that you want to persist once the user closes the application. And one of the best ways we can do that in Android is to use the SharedPreferences API. And that allows us to save key and value pairs of data so that we can access them easily. Now here's a demonstration of what our app will be able to do. We're going to have a button on our screen that the user will be able to tap to access the settings. And we're going to have an edit text for username and a checkbox to turn on and off sound effects. So for username, if we click in here and type something in and then click OK and return back to our app, then we're going to capture the information from the shared preferences and display it on the screen. So then if we go back in again, we should be able to make a change in here and then return back and see the change applied on our screen. Now, every application in Android has a shared preferences storage area that you can utilize. And since each application runs in its own sandbox, these preferences are only available for your particular application. So they're not shared with the rest of the apps. So to get started, I'm going to go back into the files and I'm going to show you the setup that I have so far. In my layout, I just have a button, and my button is called Launch Preferences. So we'll be referencing that in our Java code. And my text view, where the result of our shared preferences is going to go, is called username txt. Now I have made some changes and some modifications to the settings preferences Java file, and basically it's been set up. It's still going to load the main page that has our button on it, but I have the onset listener, so I have a reference for the button and an on-click listener for when that button is clicked. And what we need to do is to set this up so that when it is clicked, it's going to load our preferences screen. So since our preferences screen will be a new activity, we have to create a new activity. So I'm going to start by right-clicking on my package name, and I'm going to choose New Class. And I'm going to name it Preferences. And the superclass for this is going to be for Preference Activity. So as soon as I start to type in preference, you can see Preference Activity pop up. And then I'm going to click Finish. Right, so we have the main structure here for our preferences Java file. So our class preferences extends the preference activity. So just like we have in here where we have a new class name extends activity, instead we're extending preference activity. So it's a specialized thing for preferences. Now, just like in here, we override and we call the onCreate, so we want to do the same thing in Preferences Java. So I'm just going to start to type in onCreate and pop up our helper, and I'm going to choose the first onCreate. Now, in the regular Java class, right, it sets the content view to main, which is what loads our activity and our main XML file. But with preferences, it works a little bit differently. But we're still going to be loading an XML file, so we need to create that before we can do anything else with it. So I'm going to create a new Android XML file. I'm just going to go up here onto the toolbar and choose Opens a Wizard to help create a new Android XML file. Now the type of XML file in this case is a preference, and I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to call it prefs.xml. And we want to make sure that the root element is preference screen, and we'll click Finish. So we have our new XML file, and I'm just going to go right into the XML code. So just like we used our layout XML, our root here is preference screen, And the different elements that we put in here are going to be things related to our preferences. Now, we don't have the graphical layout options where we can just click and drag to pull things in. We have to code this part out by hand, but it's not too bad. The first thing in our preferences screen is going to be a username with a edit text and then a checkbox. So we're going to add the XML code in here in order to be able to give us these things. So I'll switch back to this as we start to build this so that you can see where this information is coming from. As soon as I type in my less than symbol, you can see we have these different options to choose from. So I'm going to choose an edit text preference. And the first thing we're going to add in here is the key, and I'm going to give it a name. The first one is username. Now remember, our preferences are stored in key and value pairs. So username is going to let us access the information that will be saved in our preferences in the edit text for this. So this is the key to access the value of what's going to be entered in here. The next piece of information is the title. Now the title is what shows up here, in this case username with a capital U. And then the last piece of information that we're going to include in here is the summary. And the summary is a little bit more descriptive information to help the user know what they should be able to check or not check, or what making a change in there will do for them. Okay, so next we're going to have a checkbox. And as I start to type this in, again we get the checkbox preference. And I'm just going to copy and paste these in and just change them to modify for my checkbox. So the key is going to be sound. I'm just going to have this title say music and sound effects, and then what they should know about this. Okay, so I'm going to save that. So now we have to go to our preferences Java file and tell it to load in this layout for our preferences screen. Now we don't use the set content view in here. Again, it's slightly different. And this is the add preferences from resource. And rather than RID, we're saying RXML. And our XML file is the prefs XML. So that should take care of when our button is clicked to load the preferences Java file, and it will be using this prefs XML for our layout. So we have to, in order, this works like a regular activity, so that means we have to go into the Android manifest. Also too, I'm going to point out here that when we did make that prefs XML file, it did create a separate XML folder and put prefs into it. So we didn't have to make the folder, it knew to do that. So let's open up the manifest file, and we have to go to the application tab, and we have to add this activity so that it's registered. So I'm going to choose the activity, and I'm going to browse, and I'm going to choose my preferences activity, and then save my manifest file. So now that this is registered in the manifest, we've gone through the whole cycle of creating the class file, we have a layout file, and it's been registered in the Android manifest. So the last thing there is to do is to go into the Java file and set up our on-click listener so that when it is clicked, it will open up our other activity. Okay, so just like we have done with other activities, we create an intent, and we're saying our intent to open up is preferences, and then we start the activity. And I need to import in intent, and I think we have everything saved, ready to go. I'm going to run this and we'll give it a test. Okay, so when I tap this, it should load. Yes, it loads our preferences. So I should be able to come in here and enter some information, and we can check and uncheck. And when we go back out, this hasn't updated yet, but if I go back into my preferences, check mark is still there, and my name is still there. So now let's go in and see how we can set it up so that we can get the value back out of our shared preferences and display the username. So we'll go back into our Java file, and what I'm going to do is create a separate method for loading in the preferences. So I'm just going to call this load preferences, and then I need to create it down here. Oh, I don't want to have this in my onClick. I want this to be up here. That looks better. So now I have a method that's going to call a load preferences. So we need to set this up in here in order to go out to the shared preferences and get the values back, and then put it into that text view. Okay, so I've pasted in some code here, and let's just review what this will do. We have our shared preferences, and so we're creating settings. Let me import these in so that we don't have any more errors showing. Right, so we have shared preferences. We're going to call it settings, and that's going to be equal to preference manager get default shared preferences and get application context. So this is going to get the shared preferences, and it's going to be called settings from this point forward. So now we can access the values from the shared preferences. Now this is setting up a reference to the user text field, the text view that's in our layout file. Once we have that reference, then we can start to take and put text into it. So we have username set text, and set text is going to go to the shared preferences, which is settings, and it's going to get string for username. So remember, username was our key, and it's going to get the value, and it's going to put it into username text. I look like I have too many closing curly braces. Okay, so now let me save this, and we'll run it and see whether we can get the value for our shared preferences to show on the main screen. So yes, when it loads, it comes up with that information. So now if I go in and I change something, and then I go back out to my app, it didn't update. So we need to figure out how to get it to update. Well, first of all, let's look at why it didn't update. Our load preferences is in the onCreate method. So this will only happen when it's launching. We want it to update whenever there's a change. So actually, luckily for us, there is a method for that called register on shared preference change listener. So we're going to say settings, register on shared preference change listener. And the listener in this case is this activity. So now if I hover over this for the quick fix, it says that we don't really need an unregister shared, and we don't really need this, but we do need to implement the on shared preference change listener. So if I click that, it's going to add it up here. So our activity is also going to implement the on shared preference change listener. It looks like we still have an error here, and that's because when we added the on shared preference change listener, there are required methods. So we can come down here and choose add unimplemented method, and what it'll do is down here it's going to add in the method that should happen if there is a change in the setting preferences. So what we really want to have happen is when there is a change, we want it to load the preferences again. We want it to come back up here and say get the preferences, put them into the text view, and then listen to see if there are any more changes. So we'll call that method again. So now let's test it. Okay, so it did get the name, but this is because it's starting from the beginning. So it did the onCreate again, so it was getting the updated information from the shared preferences. So if I go in and let's change it to something else, click OK, go back to our app, now it updates. So we've got the whole cycle here. We're setting preferences, we're creating a preferences screen that will load when we click on our button, and then we are loading the preferences in from that file, and in this case we're just displaying something into a simple text view just to learn how to get data or information back out of the preferences file.